Welcome to the Permanent Podcast. This is a mini season on diligence. Tim, why are we talking about diligence?
Diligence is a huge part of any investment firm's investment process, but it's shrouded in secrecy, and we just wanted to demystify it.
So we've open sourced our diligence process here at Permanent Equity. Let's diligence confidently. Diligence is too big of a task to navigate by yourself. You're going to need to assemble a team. Emily and Taylor are going to walk through how to do that, who you need on your team, who you shouldn't have on your team, and how to build a team to navigate due diligence confidently. This conversation just scratches the surface of a much longer article that we published on our website. You can go to permanentequity.com/diligence and look for the article titled Building Your Diligence Team.
You kind of can think about it as like recruiting your league of gentlemen, right? Some of these people are going to be people from your own team inside of your business, and some people are going to be external advisors, and some people try to do this all themselves. And so part of what we're trying to articulate here is that rarely is your best option to do it all yourself. So the first question is, who in your organization are you going to involve? How are you going to involve them? And what steps are you going to take in terms of assigning accountability to them in the diligence process, but also making sure that they appreciate the confidentiality of what's going on, and that they also understand that it's not yet a closed deal. So it's not yet a done deal, right? Typically, you most often involve CFO or controller. And then if you have a chief operating officer, and if you are an uninvolved owner in some way, then typically your CEO, right? Those are the people that you're going to involve, because they're going to be the ones who are actually pulling information and responding to diligence requests. So you have that team that you want to assemble. And then the question is, what are the other positions that you want to fill by outside advisors, and where do you want to go recruit those people from? So the big one is, if you're doing an M&A deal for the first time, you don't have a history of working with an M&A lawyer. We really, really advise that you don't use a general business attorney or your personal attorney as your representation in an M&A deal. If they've never done a purchase agreement before and they don't really understand the nuances of purchase agreements or the nuances of a business deal translated into a legal deal, it can become much more expensive and much harder to close, because there are a lot of risk-related definitions within a purchase agreement that most lawyers don't deal with in general business, like contract law. So the other role that typically people will involve is some sort of tax advising. Because when you sell a business as an owner, you can allocate certain percentages of the value to different things, and each one of those things has a different tax consequence. So like what counts as capital gains versus ordinary income type of equivalent, but think about it as like what's goodwill, what's assigned to equipment that you owned, all that kind of stuff. So you want someone who advises on how you will want to allocate it for the purposes of reporting to the IRS and for thinking about where the money should ultimately end up. And that can be, kind of wealth advisory related and thinking about trusts and that, like tax consequences. Do you want to pay taxes now or pay taxes later? All that kind of stuff. So you, on a personal level, want that as an individual owner, but it also does have business consequences in thinking about how value is allocated within the business deal. Then the other piece is, who's going to do the work of putting things into diligence folders?
Is that the diligence quarterback?
So it can be. The diligence quarterback for our purposes is a combined person who is managing the information gathering, but also managing relationships. On the seller side, oftentimes that can be split. So you as a seller can be managing the relational side and making sure that you understand the business deal. And you may have an intermediary or advisor who manages the information gathering and diligence data book, right? This is the person who actually manages the data room. We typically would provide a data room and say, you need to number everything. It needs to fall into these categories that now reflect our diligence checklist, right? So you have to go through and answer every single one of those. So there's a huge administrative burden on that. And then there's also the element of knowing, if something is applicable or not to the business based on its model. Most of the time, you will hopefully have a buyer like us who will make sure that we're not asking questions that are irrelevant to your business. Your answer may still be, it's not relevant, but that's a confirmation that it's not relevant. It's not obvious to both parties. If it's obvious to both parties, hopefully that's been left out. But either way, you need somebody who's going to go in and answer all of that stuff. And that can be a huge reason why you would hire an intermediary. So there's like two functions that an intermediary can serve. They can make the market for you, so make introductions to potential investors and help to facilitate those initial conversations. There are lots of reasons why you might go down that path. But the other version of it is helping you get through diligence, because it is in essence adding another job to what you already have going on. And you don't want your business to take a hit during your diligence period, because that has all kinds of negative consequences to the deal. So with that, you want to make sure that if you're already spread thin in operating a business, that you're not adding another job on top of it without making sure that you have the appropriate resources around you.
Tips, advice for hiring an advisor and lawyer, good interview questions to ask, how to find the right one for you.
It would be worth asking Taylor for 5 minutes just to walk through the lawyer specifically, like what are the qualifications that you're looking for, and should you accept like the referral of your general business attorney, and what kind of record would you look for in a deal attorney? Because I do think those are kind of specific things, and he would be much better equipped to answer those.
When it comes to hiring a lawyer in connection with a transaction, I would first say this. People hear the word lawyer and
get real excited.
They get excited, and they also equate it oftentimes to doctor. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, if you had a broken arm, you wouldn't go see your cardiologist, right? The same is absolutely the case when it comes to the practice of law, and in particular, mergers and acquisitions. There is a reason that there are M&A lawyers, and that is because the practice of mergers and acquisition is very nuanced, and it is very focused on a particular set of laws and skills. So with that in mind, one of the things I see most often is that a seller will come to a transaction and they've got their family lawyer or the person that they've worked with a lot, and maybe that person is a general practitioner. Maybe they're a trust and estates lawyer. Maybe they're whatever it is. And I can appreciate that they have a level of trust built up with that individual. And I'm not going to say that that doesn't have its place and isn't worthwhile. What I am going to say, though, is that that person is probably not going to be best positioned to help you get your business across the finish line in this transaction. They're not going to necessarily understand and appreciate what goes into a successful transaction. So first, let me say that when putting together your team and getting that lawyer involved, you should look for an M&A lawyer. Second, earlier is always better. I've said this before. I'll repeat it here again. You never have a second chance to make a first impression. So what I mean by that is if you get that person involved 6, 12 months before you're ready to quote unquote go to market, that's always better. It doesn't mean that you can't do a deal if you haven't had them pulled in advance. But what I'm saying is oftentimes they can look at the very same issues that we've been discussing throughout the diligence process and say, here's the types of questions that they're going to be asking. So let's start to get all this stuff prepared so that when they come asking those questions, we have responses that are ready to go, that are complete, that are thorough. And oh, by the way, if there's a few things that need some cleaning up, let's go ahead and do that in advance so that when we present this to the buyer, we are presenting a nice, clean, tidy package.
Or for free, read our diligence checklist.
I'm not going to encourage people to practice law on their own, but yes, David.
I'm
yes,
just kidding.
You're 100% right. No, that's true.
That is a group of people who we are making this for that we haven't really specifically addressed, but it's people who haven't decided to go to market yet, but want to work and build up the correct hygiene.
Absolutely.
To get the deal done the right way.
Absolutely. And what I would say is that a experienced transaction counsel can help facilitate these things. And I think educated sellers, after reading this, will know the types of things that they should be looking out for. And so when their counsel, who they're engaging with, comes and says, what do you need for me to do? How can I start help getting involved? What is it? You can go to them with a list of things that says, well, here's what I'm interested in, here's what I'm concerned about, instead of having them necessarily dictate what they think needs to have happen. An educated seller, an educated client is always preferred. And I say that after years of working with clients. I love a client who's engaged, who's educated, and who knows specifically what they want and where they have sensitivity in a transaction. Absolutely. When you are engaging with your M&A lawyer, you should help identify those issues, and you should say, this is what I want. But having experienced M&A counsel is super important in that process of getting ready. Now, let's talk about the next stage, though, when it actually comes time for the transaction. While you may not have as much experience with them, or you may not have a long-standing relationship, what I can tell you is this: you will ultimately get through a transaction in a more expedient fashion with counsel who is used to reviewing, understanding, drafting, revising all the types of documents that come along with a transaction of this nature. It's going to take them less time to review it, to get through them. They're going to understand the issues from the outset. They're going to appreciate a buyer's sensitivities on certain issues. And oftentimes, I think one of the challenges that happens when you have inexperienced transaction counsel is they will get focused on issues that, in the grand scheme of things, really don't matter that much. And so the parties end up spending time on issue X when really we really ought to be focused on issue Y. I don't want to say it's going to save you money in the long term, in the long run, but I think the process is going to be easier and more smooth when you have counsel representing you that has an appreciation for the life cycle of a transaction.
In terms of looking for support from an advisor or intermediary, you want to understand what types of businesses they typically represent and to whom they sell them. If they typically sell things only to strategics, or if they typically are ESOP advisors, if that's not the outcome you're seeking, they may not be the right type of advisor for you, right? So there's that initial qualification of how relevant to my situation are your services. Once you get past that, you also want to understand the monetary consequences, because there are a lot of fee models within the advisory and intermediary community. The most common are that they'll take a straight percentage on a deal. That's more common in smaller deals because the work is relatively the same regardless of the deal. So if the deal is smaller, they're probably going to take a larger share of deal proceeds. And then as you kind of move up the stack, it moves towards a combination of structures. So sometimes there is a retainer for signing up with an advisor. So you'll pay them some amount of money every month as they're representing you, but it goes against your deal fee. So you're kind of prepaying before a deal has closed, in essence. Then there's another model, which is called the Lehman formula, where you're paying 5% on the first million, 4% on the next million, 3% on the next million, 2% on the next million, and then 1% on everything else past that. The important components of that are understanding what counts as millions in relation to that deal. And really, regardless of the structure, what is the fee structure against? Because what's common language in M&A is called consideration. Consideration basically encompasses all forms of value. It's not specifically cash. So if you start to think about, assigning an enterprise value to a company versus the cash you receive, if you are paying a percentage on all consideration, then you may be receiving a relatively small proportion of that in cash and still owe a fee on the full amount. So the fee negotiation on a deal is pretty important and something that we advise people make sure that they clearly understand before signing up with an advisor. A good advisor costs money, and they should. They do a fair amount of work on your behalf, and they can be very helpful. But there are also situations in which people don't provide a lot of material service, but because they signed you up for an exclusivity period of 2 to 3 years, you may end up in a situation where you owe them considerable amounts of money, especially if you think about it as being pre-tax proceeds that can affect how much you end up taking home from even a meaningful deal. So after you get past the fee piece, then you go into what you want to use their services for. And that obviously relates to what they're charging for. So again, the two functions are you can have them make the market. And then the other side of it is you can use them to help facilitate the diligence process and serve as a liaison that's focused on the business deal, not just the legal deal or not just the tax deal, right? So you're going to have specialists that are focused on the legal and tax components, but this is the person who is trying to make sure both parties are working towards the business objective associated with the deal. I think at the end of the day, the other thing to keep in mind is the individual seller is the decision maker. And so keep in mind that the people contributing are contributing based on their area of expertise, and they're trying to do well by you, right? So the people who work for you are trying to do well by you. The people you hire as advisors are trying to do well by you, and everyone that is involved, you are paying to some level, right? And so their incentives are aligned to make sure that they are proving their value to you. You, at the end of the day, though, as the owner, are the decision maker. And so you need to make decisions that make sense for you. And that's why we keep harping on the idea of this being a business deal, and you are the primary negotiator of the business deal. So in practical terms, this can be why your lawyer may say, this is important. I think this is important, and I think we should fight for this. And then you have a business conversation with the buyer to talk about why they have their point of view, and if it's important to them to figure out if this is just solvable outside of the legal environment. And if it's not, then trying to figure out, is this something that I want to risk business deal dynamics on, right? And you kind of have those trade-offs to play with the entire time that you're in negotiation. You do need to be the quarterback of your own deal from a relational standpoint and a business standpoint. And then everyone that's working with you is doing so in your best interest or trying to, but they're not you. So you want to treat it that way and make sure that you've assembled enough people with great expertise to provide insight to you and extend your capacity, but you're not delegating the deal to them.
You're getting to know our diligence team through this podcast, but you can also find out more about who works here and who you might be partnering with if you go through a sale with us at permanentequity.com. We have one more episode left on this diligence mini season where Taylor will share the one diligence mistake you shouldn't make.